So again, this is the Accessibility and Procurement webinar, the final webinar of the winter lunchtime accessibility webinar series. Today we have Carol Thompson from University of Washington, and then I'll follow up with some additional information at the end. So again, I'm Jess Thompson with the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. So Carol, I'm going to make you presenter now and pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jess, and thanks everybody for coming today. It is officially Procurement Day here at the University of Washington. Immediately after this webinar, I'm going to stroll over to campus, and today is Tech Connect. So it's a big internal IT conference. So people from throughout campus are talking about things that are happening in their IT realms, and lots of people are attending events and participating in conversations and watching panels and lectures, and there's a heavy emphasis on accessibility and procurement at this event. So immediately after this, I'm going to be part of a panel with people from procurement services and some others who have done some really innovative things with accessibility in contracts. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in the webinar today. So our objectives today are to, first of all, provide some backdrop. So we'll talk a little bit about the laws and the standards that apply to us, state agencies and state higher education institutions related to accessibility. And we'll talk about how we're addressing accessibility at the UW, and maybe there'll be some lessons learned from our experience that you can apply to your experience, specifically related to procurement. And then I'm going to toss it back to Jess to talk about several what-if scenarios, such as, what if we can't do testing, or what if we've already bought the product and it's not accessible? What if nothing is accessible that meets a particular need that we have? So those are all legitimate questions, and sometimes the answers are difficult to come by, or even uncomfortable answers, but hopefully we can sort of talk through some of that and help you to make sense of it. So starting with the accessibility laws, policies, and available standards, this goes back a long time, actually. The Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was civil rights law, still is civil rights law, that requires that recipients of federal funding not discriminate against participants with disabilities. And so as recipients of federal funding, those of us in higher education have always, since 1973, had to ensure that our programs and services and activities were accessible to students with disabilities. And the Americans with Disabilities Act, a little bit later, in 1990, just sort of extended the scope of that. It was still civil rights law. It still required that programs and services were accessible, but it wasn't just recipients of federal funding anymore. It really applied to all of society, in a sense. And certainly we, as state agencies or higher education institutions, had to comply with both of these laws and have always had to ensure that our programs and services were accessible. So what's changed over the years is that back in 73 and even in 1990, we weren't using technology nearly like we are today. So there was no web accessibility, no concept of that. Even in 1990, the web was in its infancy, if even that, and it took a while before technology to really explode on the scene and become as all-pervasive as it is today. Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was the same Rehabilitation Act from 73 but was amended in 1998, that is important to us for a couple of reasons. First of all, it doesn't apply to us directly. It was assuming that attendees here are not federal agencies or representatives of federal agencies, but this required that the federal government be accessible, that it have accessible electronic and information technology. And so it's specifically applied to federal agencies and have some very specific requirements related to information technology. And so in order to make that enforceable and something that people could follow, there needed to be some standards that specifically defined what accessible IT is. And so that's why it's important to us is that that standards arose from passage of Section 508, and a couple of years later, in the early 2000s, those standards were published into the Federal Register. And so those became the Section 508 standards that defined web accessibility and software accessibility and several other categories of information technology. And those were unchanged for a very long time until just recently. Those were the official information technology accessibility standards that were written into law. There also are other standards, which we're going to talk about on another slide, that were sort of competing standards when it comes to web accessibility, and those were from the World Wide Web Consortium, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, affectionately known as WCAG. And there have been numerous resolutions and settlements over the years, particularly in like the last decade. Those have really accelerated. We're seeing more and more legal challenges against companies and higher education institutions and municipalities who have inaccessible websites, are using inaccessible software or other technologies, and they're being challenged because there are people who should have access to programs and services, but because those programs and services are delivered using technology, there are barriers being erected that prevent them from fully participating. And so virtually all of the resolutions and settlements in recent years have identified a particular standard that needs to be met related to information technology, and that is the WCAG, the WCAG 2.0 Level 2A. So again, I'll talk more about that on the next slide. But we also have in the state of Washington, Washington State Policy 188, which requires that state agencies, including higher education institutions, ensure that their IT is accessibility, and that has some very specific requirements related to that, including accessibility within the procurement process. So anything that we are purchasing or procuring needs to be accessible. And really it has always needed to be accessible via the federal laws that we are obligated to follow. But Washington State Policy 188 just sort of emphasizes that and brings that to the foreground that this is something that we need to pay attention to. So I mentioned WCAG. This goes back a long way. Actually, in the early 2000s, or actually in the 1990s, the early days of the web, the W3C was aware that the web could become a problem for people with disabilities, and that wasn't the vision at all. The vision was that the web was going to be the great equalizer, and people everywhere would have access at their fingertips to information in an unprecedented way. And the fact that any group of people, just because of the technologies they're using or because of certain characteristics, couldn't participate in that or couldn't access that information was not what the W3C wanted at all. And so they created a web accessibility initiative within the W3C, and the participants in that initiative started working on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to inform web developers and web designers what it means to design a web page and develop a web page that is accessible to individuals with disabilities. And so version 1 of that, it took throughout the 90s to really hammer that out and negotiate that and figure out what all the accessibility issues were, both the problems and the solutions. And finally in 1999 they published WCAG 1. And since then, it has been upgraded to WCAG 2, and WCAG 2 remains the standard today. And within that, it's sort of a hierarchy, but the deepest level within the guidelines document are success criteria, which are essentially checkpoints. So the specific things that you need to do in order to ensure that your website or web application is accessible to individuals with disabilities. And these are written in a way that are general enough that the principles and the success criteria apply not just to websites, but to software in general and to digital documents and so forth. So they are pretty broadly applicable. But each success criteria is assigned a level. So there's level A, 2A, and 3A, and that corresponds roughly with the priority. So level A are the highest priority. If you don't address these issues, then there are going to be groups of people that cannot access your content at all. And level 2A are maybe a slightly lower priority, but still pretty high priority. And also the degree of difficulty comes to play in assigning the levels. So level 3A success criteria are actually pretty difficult, in some cases very difficult to meet. Level 2A are perhaps more difficult than level A. So these levels are kind of a balancing of how realistic it is to implement, how difficult, and how important or critical for particular groups of users. And so there's always been a question since WCAG was passed as to what the requirements are, how accessible is accessible enough. And that had been sort of some gray area in the early days, but with all of the legal cases and the resolutions and the settlements, it has become very clear that level 2A is the goal. So that's what we need to aspire to achieve, are the 26 level A success criteria plus the 13 level 2A success criteria. So what does that mean exactly? What kind of things are we talking about? Well, there's a list here on this slide. Things like alt text on images. So somebody who can't see the image has access to a brief description that their screen reader or braille device can read. Captions on videos. So somebody can't hear the content, they still get access to the audio portion of the video presentation. Not using color as the sole means of communicating information. So, required fields are in red. Well, if somebody can't perceive the difference between red and an adjacent color, then that communication is not going to work for them. Having proper heading structure. That's important in web pages, in Word docs, in PDF docs. Virtually every authoring tool that allows you to create documents supports heading structure. So you can have a heading 1, which is the main heading of the page, heading 2, or subheadings underneath heading 1, heading 3, which are sub-subheadings if your document goes that deep, and so forth. And it's important for those headings to actually communicate the outline of the document, because that helps people who can't see the content to jump from heading to heading to heading and kind of get an outline and understand how this document is structured and how all of its parts relate to one another. Labels on form fields. So somebody is filling out a digital form, they need to know what the purpose of the field that they're in is. What sort of prompts are there that tell me what I can enter into this field. Somebody can't see, then that needs to be explicitly coded into the page so that screen readers understand how to fill this form out. Visible indication of keyboard focus. If you just tab through any web page, particularly in Firefox or IE, where the visible focus that's built in is not real prominent, then one of the biggest problems that happens for keyboard users is it's very difficult to figure out where you are within a web page or an application. And so that actually is a really simple fix for web pages using cascading style sheets, but not a lot of people are aware of that. So these are just 6 items. Obviously, there are a lot more than that, but it gives you kind of an indication of what the issues are when we're talking about level A and level 2A. So as we're procuring web applications or software, then we need to have products that meet these sorts of issues, meet these success criteria, or else we're gonna be erecting barriers for some of our users. So why is this important within procurement? Well, we're not building everything on our own anymore. This used to be true at the University of Washington, that we created a lot of the stuff that we use for a long time, rather than have a learning management system, when virtually every other college campus in the country had a learning management system such as Blackboard or WebCT that they were using. We were developing our own. We had a suite of tools that we had created, and we're the institution that created Pine. And there actually, up until recently, were a lot of people that still use that. I was surprised when I came to the university how many people are still using Pine for their email client. So we were very much a do-it-yourself, develop the capacity internally to create things kind of institution. But even here, that's changed significantly, and we now are much more dependent than ever on third-party software services and web applications. So we're going out and finding these things and procuring them, and that's how we do business. And much of what students face and employees face and the general public faces from us are built on things that were procured from third-party sources. So the problem that creates is if there are barriers for some groups of users, if we create it ourselves, we could fix it ourselves. But now we have little or no ability, depending on the product, to fix issues. So we're really dependent on those third-party developers to do it correctly, or to be flexible enough and responsive enough that they can address problems as they arise. If there are barriers, then who's responsible? It's not actually the vendor. None of those laws that we talked about requires anybody that produces products to, other than the federal government, to produce products that are accessible. A company can create a product that is totally inaccessible and that nobody can use. They're not required by law to build an accessible product. However, we, as covered entities under both the ADA and Section 504, do have to ensure that the programs and services that we are delivering are accessible. And so if there's a problem with some software that we're using or a web application that we're using, then we are responsible for that. The vendor is not responsible for that from a legal standpoint. Therefore, we really have to ensure that the products and services we're procuring from third parties are accessible to all users. So, we've got to stress to the vendors that we're doing business with that your product puts us at legal risk. And, if I'm going to use your product, then I might be committing a crime. And is that really what you want? Do you want to put your customers in that sort of position? So, this is collaborative, and we really need them to understand the magnitude of that and work with them to help them to create accessible products so that, we all win from that. So how do we do that? How do we approach this problem? Well, here at the University of Washington, we've identified 3 steps, and I think these steps are pretty broadly applicable. The first is that we need to ask for accessibility. So if vendors don't hear it from us that accessibility is important, then they don't build accessible products. So they need anybody who is shopping for a product to ask about accessibility, or that's what we need. The accessibility movement needs people to ask for this. So we have to solicit accessibility information. So particularly for products that go through like an RFP process, then we need to get accessibility built into the RFP. So vendors have to respond to that, and they have to tell us about the accessibility of their product. Also, if we're having a conversation with a vendor about accessibility, is your product accessible is too general and too easy to answer yes to, even if they really don't have an accurate answer. A question like, please explain how you ensure your product is accessible to all users, including those with disabilities, is a better question because it gets at process. And, in order to answer that question, the vendor really has to have an answer. They can't just sort of BS their way through that. Also, there are ways to document whether you're accessible. There are standard ways. The most common is a voluntary product accessibility template, or VPAT. And so a lot of vendors, particularly those that do business with the federal government, will already have a VPAT for the products that we're considering. And so that is, as we're asking for accessibility in an RFP, then we need to be specific. Please provide a VPAT to document your accessibility, and it needs to be up to date, because VPATs often are created and then just sort of not updated as the product is updated, so it might not be current information. Also, VPAT, the VPAT template was created in response to Section 508. So those Section 508 standards, again, were published originally in 2000, so 18 years ago. And they were essentially a checklist that followed the Section 508 standards. So those were not the W3C standards. It was that other set of standards that was published specifically for federal agencies who had to comply with Section 508. And so VPAT would take those Section 508 standards and identify for each checkpoint, whether their product meets this checkpoint or not. And so that's the old school VPAT. There's a new version of the VPAT, VPAT 2.0, which is based on WCAG 2.0, not the old Section 508 standards. And so that's important because most of the VPATs that are out there are still that old school Section 508 version. And so if we ask, if we say the product that we're looking for needs to meet WCAG 2 Level 2A, because that's the standard that we are legally held to, then we want you to document how you meet WCAG 2.0 Level 2A. And if they provide an old Section 508 VPAT, that doesn't answer the question. It addresses accessibility, and there is some overlap between the two, but they're not the same. There are significant differences, and so it does, these days, need to be a VPAT 2.0. So I think we need to specify that in what sort of documentation we'll accept. Finally, I've got a few VPATs to share here on the upcoming slides. You'll see that VPATs are not all that reliable because this is the company who is filling it out, and they may or may not know enough to fill it out accurately, or they may be deceptive in how they fill it out. I know, I've heard some crazy stories about marketing teams who are charged with filling out VPATs rather than the technical crew or the quality assurance testers or people that might actually know. It tends to fall on marketing for some companies. I've also heard of companies who have had their legal team review the VPAT after it was created and have scratched things out that revealed accessibility flaws because they felt that was a liability. So then, what could be a reliable source of information about a product becomes an unreliable source of information about a product. So that's why the third bullet here says the preferred means of delivering documentation about accessibility is an accessibility report from an independent accessibility expert or consultant. There are a number of consultants out there, a growing number actually, about a dozen that have been around for a very long time and are trusted and credible. Even though, it could be argued that it's not a totally unbiased source if there's money exchanged for this service. But we have to place some trust somewhere, and I feel like it's easier to trust an independent, established accessibility expert, and that could be a requirement then that a company has to produce this report or a VPAT even that was filled out by a trusted independent source. So let's look at a few VPATs just to kind of give you a sense for some of the problems that we see with them, as well as there's at least one good example in here. But the way this is laid out is, again, you've got a 3-column table essentially, and over on the left side you have the criteria, which in the old VPAT is Section 508 standards, and in the new VPAT it's W3C WCAG guidelines or success criteria. The middle column, supporting features, is a multiple choice question. So it either supports, which means accessibility is supported, or our product supports this particular criteria, or it supports with exceptions, which means it more or less supports it. Generally, it's pretty accessible, but there are a few exceptions. Or it does not support, which means we are lacking in this area, have some work to do, or it's not applicable. And I think there might be a couple of other options in there as well. And then the remarks and explanations column is really the most important column of all, because that qualifies the choice that they selected in supporting features. So, if they say that their product supports this checkpoint, then they need to explain why they say that. What have they done specifically that addresses this particular issue? And even more importantly, perhaps, if they say supports with exceptions, we need to know what those exceptions are, because our goal here really is to understand the accessibility limitations of this product, so that we know, if we deploy this, how many of our users are going to have a problem with it, and how significant is that problem? Are they not going to be able to complete certain functions at all? Then that might be a serious enough problem that we really can't take the risk of purchasing this product. So I forgot to talk about that particular example. So this is a not so good example that the company did not answer the supporting features, and that's a multiple choice question. They left it blank. And under remarks and explanations, they say for the first item, which has to do with being able to operate everything with the keyboard, they say no accessibility limitations. So that sounds great. Not something that maybe you could conclude from that they are fully accessible to the keyboard. But when there's so little detail provided, that should always raise suspicions. And then item B, there's a lot of detail there in that checkpoint about applications not disrupting accessibility features of the operating system, essentially, or the browser if it's a web application. If people turn on certain accessibility features on their computer, then the applications that they're running should support those features. They shouldn't be obstructed by those features or by the product. So sometimes products actually override user settings or ignore user settings, and therefore the accessibility tools that people are dependent on don't work when they're operating for that particular application. So this company's answer to that was no disruptions. So again, no detail at all, and that raises suspicions as to whether they really even understand what that checkpoint is. So in contrast, and this is, I tried to choose neutral examples, but this is Canvas. They specifically acknowledge that they mention themselves here. But the same questions for the keyboard checkpoint, they say supports, and then they provide some remarks related to that as to why they chose that answer. We strive to make sure all sections of Canvas can be navigated and controlled with only a keyboard. So just a simple sentence, but it shows that they understand the checkpoint. So there's at least that. And the same thing with the second answer. Canvas does not interfere with any operating system or browser shortcuts. Accessibility features such as sticky keys, magnifiers, screen readers, cursor sizes, and virtual keyboards are not disabled or disrupted by Canvas. So once again, they provide enough detail in their response that it's clear that whoever filled this out really understands what the checkpoint is getting at, and we can trust that this is providing better information than the first example. Example 3, we've got a few different criteria here. I made the list a little bit longer just so you can see the pattern. Under supporting features, first of all, they didn't do the multiple choice thing, so that's how this is set up, and they didn't follow the instructions. Instead, they have some cookie cutter text that they pasted into that column for every checkpoint that says product has been coded to meet this standard subject to the remarks on the right. And then you look over on the right and there's nothing in the rightmost column. So this is a VPAT that is 100% meaningless, and we just can't, we don't know anything about the accessibility of this product, and we certainly can't trust that this is an accessible product or this company knows what they're doing when it comes to accessibility. So this is what we're dealing with VPATs. We ask for accessibility. We specifically require a VPAT, and these days we should be specifically requiring VPAT 2. But regardless of whether it's VPAT 1 or 2, companies may not have the expertise to fill out a VPAT, and it might just be something they're trying to do just to get over all of the procurement hurdles and get their product out there. So what do we do with this information? Well, that's step 2. So step 1 is to ask for accessibility. Then vendors respond, and hopefully they respond in the way that we have asked them to. And then step 2 is we have to validate the accessibility information we received. So I'm of the position, and we at the University of Washington, I think collectively are of the position that everybody who makes a purchasing decision needs to be able to have a conversation with the vendor about accessibility, but they don't have to be accessibility experts, and it's unrealistic for them to be accessibility experts. And I think this is true. There are a lot of parallels between accessibility and security or privacy, that we also want products that don't have huge security loopholes that people are going to be able to exploit and access sensitive information. So how do we know whether a product meets those criteria? Well, most of us aren't security experts any more than we are accessibility experts. This is why we turn to third parties, and we prefer a third-party independent assessment. But whatever the vendor provides in response to step 1 is a starting point for accessibility conversation. So the VPAT is not, even for a good VPAT like Canvas, that tells us they really seem to know about accessibility. This seems to be a trustworthy source, but it shouldn't be relied upon as the sole source of information or as the final source of information. We can't look at that and say, okay, this is a certification of accessibility. We can trust that this is accessible. It's a starting point. So the way we use VPATs, and we're doing more and more trainings here at the University of Washington, which is actually a part of what I'm doing today later on, is let's look at some VPATs together and develop the capacity to figure out what to ask next. So when you review a VPAT, the goal is to come up with some questions that you can ask based on what the VPAT tells you. So, and some other questions, that you can ask are, what have you done to ensure your product or service is accessible to users with disabilities? So again, talking about process, not, not just asking something like, is your product accessible? Have the conversation, ask follow-up questions, ask vendors to demonstrate how to perform key functions without a mouse. So that's something anybody can do, is just use their keyboard. They don't, have to have skills using assistive technologies. But we also would ultimately love for them to demonstrate with assistive technology. So if they've done testing, which is ultimately what we hope, if they've done some testing with assistive technology to ensure that their product is accessible, then somebody from their team should be able to demonstrate how this works. How can we perform this key function that you just demonstrated with a mouse and with eyesight? How can somebody using a screen reader perform that same function? So we want to develop the capacity in-house to have those conversations and to work collaboratively with vendors to help them understand our needs and to help us understand the capabilities of their products. Step 3 is assuming that products are not accessible, and the vast majority are not, then we need to figure out what the biggest problems are and get that written into contracts that they're going to address their accessibility. So we want a roadmap with specific measurable goals and timelines. We need to prioritize, and we can do this in collaboration with them. What are the biggest priorities and things that we call showstoppers, because there are some issues that are so severe people are not going to be able to use the product, and again, we're putting ourselves at serious legal risk if we deploy this as is. And so, let's get a roadmap that says, okay, these top priorities, you can fix those within the first 3 months, slightly lesser priorities within 6 months, and let's be realistic, collaboratively with what you can accomplish. Get that built into the contract and start with aggressive contract language, such as an indemnity clause for any accessibility complaints. We actually have a contract right now that is either nearly complete or on the verge of being complete, and the vendor actually has agreed to an indemnity clause. So they are very confident in their accessibility and their ability to fix any problems that come up. But assuming that a lot of vendors won't agree to such language, you can still start there and then scale back through the negotiation process. If the vendor can't make their product accessible, then it's important to have some sort of workaround, an equally effective accommodation plan. If you've got a product that's intended for employees, and what are we going to do when we have employees with disabilities who need to use this? Let's put that on the vendor, and we can work collaboratively with them. But if they're not able at the moment to provide an accessible solution, then we got to have this conversation. Okay, what do we do then for that person who needs to perform this function and they can't do it with your product? What can we do as a backup? Help us come up with a backup. Also, products change. So what we're procuring today, if it's accessible today, we want to ensure that it is accessible next time an upgrade is released. And so that is important too, to get maintenance of accessibility built into the contract. And again, this is collaborative. We've got to work with the vendors on planning and implementation of accessibility. We also, and I've actually just looked at the clock and I see that I'm really cutting into Jess's time here, so I apologize for that. I'll quickly go through performance-based contracts, which is where we're starting to get some avenues in on getting more aggressive language built into our contracts. Is this kind of trend toward performance-based contracts where you have performance measures and measurable benchmarks built into the contracts, and we can identify expected deliverables and performance measures or outcomes that are accessibility related, and have some consequences or incentives built in to ensure that agreed upon value to the customer is received. So that roadmap that we have for accessibility, they have to have some incentive perhaps for meeting the deadlines that are in that roadmap. And if they don't meet the deadlines, then we get a significant discount for every day that they are late on meeting those deadlines, something like that. So payment for goods and services under these sorts of contracts should be contingent on the contractor achieving performance outcomes. So I'm hearing more and more higher education institutions that are using this sort of approach, and we're using this for some of our enterprise level purchases and are getting some traction with it. So, so again, there are very few fully accessible products, and that should be a selling point actually as we are collaborating with vendors and negotiating with them. This is a huge opportunity for them, and it can be spun that way, that you could be the first to market with a fully accessible solution, and you're going to be hearing more and more and more customers who are needing this, and we're here to help. This collaborative process is designed to help you build an accessible product, and for us anyway, at the University of Washington, it essentially is free consulting. So hopefully they will take us up on that. So the hub for all of our information related to technology accessibility is uw.edu/accessibility. And if you add /procurement onto the end of that, then that is the page where you can see our procurement information for our own community. So I will pass it on over to Jess.
Great, thanks, Terrell. So I just want to go over some of the what ifs, because I think a lot of us have kind of turned to UW as leaders in this area. They have great expertise, but then we sometimes look back at our own institutions or agencies and say, but we don't have that expertise, so what do we do? So I'm going to kind of talk more about some of those what ifs and issues such as what if we're already using the product? So it's too late to, put it in our RFP or RFI. The contract's already been written. So the first thing you want to think about is, when is that contract up for renewal? And that might be the point where then you can introduce language into the contract. So I know here at the State Board, I've talked to our kind of contracts person who's pulling together a list. He's got, all the dates lined up for when different contracts are going to come up for renewal, and therefore we can start kind of working through and figuring out how to get that accessibility language in there. But what I think is also important is to, let the vendor know that you're going to be adding that language upon the contract renewal, so that you can kind of start that conversation early and not at the last minute. And some of that is, say, speaking from experience, where we didn't want a gap in service, and so we wanted to get the contract renewed, but we wanted to incorporate accessibility language, but we had like maybe 2 weeks or something to get that done. And so we wrote up the contract language, and the vendor came back and agreed to one sentence, and that wasn't enough for us. And so we were a little worried about, the amount of time that we had in order to resolve the issue and ensure that the contract would have some accessibility language in there. So there's different things you can do, but it all really comes back to kind of what Terrell was talking about in terms of communication. So communicating with the vendor that you're going to be looking at this, that this is going to be important for you, and seeing what they can offer in terms of a short-term or long-term roadmap. So this is another example, is our agency has a contract with a vendor that I think if not all of our colleges, and a good number of them, use this product. And it came to our attention that someone was struggling to use the product. They were using assistive technology. And so the person in our office who kind of runs that software reached out to the vendor, said, hey, we're having an issue right now. What do you recommend? So immediately kind of working with the vendor to find an alternative approach, but then also said, this isn't acceptable. What are your plans to ensure that this problem doesn't continue? And the vendor was really responsive and actually said, right now we're aware of the issue. It's not an issue if you use the mobile platform. So we had kind of the workaround. And then they provided a roadmap, and they said in the short term, in the next 6 months, here's what we intend to have fixed, and then in the next year, here's what we're working on. And so that gave us something to kind of refer back to know that the vendor is engaged in this work, even though we didn't have it in the contract at that time. So kind of going back to that other example, what if they won't agree to the contract language? So I know a lot of people are drafting up language, and we kind of start with what we think should be the ideal language, which is your product is totally compliant. But Terrell kind of said it too, start aggressive and then work your way, kind of negotiate down from there. And I think what's important here is to just make sure you include something in that contract. And I have a lot of language up on the screen, which we're going to send out separately as a resource. But here we have kind of what I consider the softest contract language that at least gets the vendor to agree to something. You're still not asking them for full-on compliance, but basically what this says is the vendor is committed to promoting and improving accessibility as specified in, we have policy 188 down, and will remain committed throughout the term of the agreement. If the product and services are found not in conformance with the applicable laws and policies, then the vendor will use reasonable efforts to update the services or product to be in conformance therewithin. And then if any event arises where it's not compliant, then the person using the product can contact the vendor, and the vendor will assign a person with accessibility expertise to reply within 2 days. And so this we felt, we realized they might not be fully compliant right now. They aren't very comfortable with some of the language that we first proposed. And so here what we're simply asking is that, again, kind of they do their best, they provide updates if something's found not to be compliant, but also that they have someone dedicated to communicate about these issues. And so that was approved by the vendor, which was good. And then there's also kind of the issue of what if nothing is accessible. And I think this sometimes happens in academic programs where faculty spend time finding the best resources for their students or the best materials, content-wise. And you're kind of under deadlines to get everything in order and contracts signed, and you come to find out something's not accessible. So what do you do in that case where you don't have time to go find an alternative, you aren't aware of an alternative to kind of switch over to? And this is something that Whatcom Community College pulled together, this approach of using a pilot. And so they send the vendor a letter, which pretty much says, the college wants to use your product, however, it doesn't meet the accessibility requirements outlined in, the various policies. And they cite their own college policy and then say, because of the listed requirements here, we cannot pursue this purchase at this time. And then they follow with, however, if the vendor's intention is to pursue making this product accessible and a roadmap can be provided, then the college will move forward on a time-restricted pilot. And then it says at the completion of the pilot, if the product meets the requirements outlined in the policies, or if it demonstrates significant progress towards meeting the requirements, then they'll issue a contract to the vendor. And so that was kind of one way of, again, kind of bringing it to the vendor's attention that this is important, giving them kind of more motivation to work on it. And it also allowed the faculty, a period of time to then start shopping around for other products in case that vendor ended up, not making enough substantial effort towards being compliant. And so I think that's a smart approach in cases where institutions and kind of agencies are still educating staff and faculty around accessibility, and so we kind of need that cultural shift to catch up before everyone's speaking the same language and requiring the same things. But I think the one-year pilot is one approach. And then there's kind of the question, what if I don't write contracts or I don't know how to test for accessibility? So maybe you are a faculty member, or maybe in your role at your agency, again, you're not writing contracts. You don't have the skills to do testing. But that first piece is to educate and advocate. And sometimes that means educating the vendor. So when I was faculty, I remember a publisher's rep had come to my office and wanted to tell me about this cool new ebook and companion website, and my students would love it. And I said, is it accessible? And the guy looked at me and just looked at me like I was an idiot and said, of course it is. It's online. It's available 24/7. And so that, that was kind of a light bulb moment for me. The sales rep had no clue what I meant by accessibility. And so part of this is, asking the sales reps about accessibility, but also educating and telling them why this is important, citing the policies so that they better understand. And I've also seen this where a publisher came back to a faculty member who said, hey, your PowerPoints aren't accessible. And the publisher said, we don't need to make them accessible because they shouldn't be distributed to students. The PowerPoint is just for the faculty member to display and use as a teaching resource. And that right there, sometimes people are short-sighted in terms of only thinking about students in higher ed. But what if that faculty member, didn't have vision and therefore couldn't use the PowerPoint? So it's also educating them to think about it's not just the end user, it's also going to be the person working on the back end or the administrator. So making sure every aspect of that product is accessible is pretty important. And again, that's part of kind of educating those sales reps, but also our colleagues when asking about accessibility. And then again, asking for product demos. So leave it on the vendor to demonstrate how someone would navigate the product with just a keyboard. Invite them to your office and take the mouse away. So I'd still love to see, at conferences when you have a bunch of vendors present, I'd love to see someone get that set up and take away all the mice for the computers. See what happens then. But put it on them to really demonstrate how someone would navigate that software so that it's not on you to figure it out and to train yourself on assistive technology, but again, it's something that the vendor can do. Another tip is to Google it. That's usually the first thing I do. If I'm watching a vendor's demo and I'm not certain how, they're not getting it accessibility, I'll quickly run a little Google search. And if nothing comes up, then, I'll ask them. But in one case, I Googled a company and their statement was that they were level A compliant. So they weren't going to look at level AA, which is the standard that all of us in Washington State are working towards. And so I was able to ask them about that. It was a good sign that they were at least committed to level A, but it's still not enough. And so sometimes a quick Google search can really help in that. And I think the biggest thing that's important not to forget is to really leverage our system and state identity. So if you're at one of our colleges, your institution isn't alone in this. You're not the only one requiring this. And so even though a vendor might be looking at you and saying, oh, you've only got 5,000 FTE, you're not a very big client, we don't really care. Make sure you're speaking as, someone from the larger community and technical college system, which is, over 100,000 FTE. I use that a lot with vendors of saying that it's not just, the state board that needs this to be accessible. It's all 34 of our colleges. It's all of our public institutions in Washington State, and it's all of our state agencies. And once they know that all of us are going to be requiring this, again, it gets right back at what Terrell said. it's a marketing strategy for them. I've had CEOs call me and ask why I want their VPAT, and when I walk through just the scope of this kind of the need for this information in our state, they get really excited. It's not something that they're just doing for me, but again, they realize this might open doors to having more clients in our state. So, so try to kind of help them see the light in that way, but really try to leverage that system and state identity, because I think that can be really powerful. So if you have any questions, Carol's email is up on the screen, tft@uw.edu. You have my email, jess.thompson@sbctc.edu. So we'll be sending out the PowerPoint as well as the recording of the webinar and additional resources around procurement once I have that video up to YouTube and captioned. And I apologize for the delay on that. I still haven't gotten the one from last week out because it's routine now that YouTube takes my videos down. So there's a little delay, but also I'll be making a new blog post with all of the webinars from this series and their associated resources plopped into one place, so it's easy to refer back to. So we actually didn't have any questions come in from the chat about the content, at least as Carol was presenting. The only question I see is about sending out the resources afterwards. So feel free to email us if you have any questions. Otherwise, thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your week. And thank you, Carol.
And thank you, Jess.